Only twice in my life have I made a big move, and not just a hop from one city apartment to another, but packing up everything and moving out of state. The first time was when I was 19. I joined the U.S. Navy, shipped off to basic, then A school, and finally the fleet. The second was when I moved from Virginia to Texas in 2018. I initially stayed with family already down here, then got on my feet, so to speak, with a new job and a new place. One of the things that struck me right off was how incredibly expensive apartments were in the area, even pre-health crisis. Back then, average rents were about $1,000 plus other expenses a month. The pay for just about every job hovered around $15 an hour. The former, I'd later come to see, would farther outpace the latter in coming years, making a bad situation catastrophic. That first job here in Texas, I'm not counting Uber Eats, that was and still is a ripoff and a topic for an entire video of its own at an undetermined date. We'll see. The first real job I had was working for a small home renovation company. For the purposes of this video, I'll just call him Brad because he reminds me of my eldest uncle with that same name. He's a wisecracking, hard-working type with little patience and a lot of different skill sets. A Renaissance man from a bygone era. Now, I learned a bunch of construction skills while in the military, but working for Brad was the first time I really got to put any of them to use. My primary job was running cables in the attic and fishing those same lines through drywall. One particularly brutal summer, about 3 months into this job, I was tasked with running lines through an attic. It was about 120 degrees, no airflow, and covered with dirty, itchy, flaking insulation material, probably asbestos. On that run, I discovered a dead snake, not just the molting, the skeleton too, and it was laying next to an equally dead rat. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back now, I believe it perfectly encapsulates my working life to date, and probably a lot of you folks too. It's hard to say what great battle may have transpired in the attic. Temperatures just north of hell, surrounded by itching powder designed to keep the indoor climate stable. Perhaps they both landed a killing blow on one another at the exact same time. Or perhaps, and this I think is the likely scenario, that rat was already dead from poison and the snake came up for a meal and succumbed to the same thing. The trap we are in as working people is that on subconscious level we want to believe there's karma somewhere buried in our work, that through merit one can possibly make it. Blame it on your boomer, Gen X parents, movies, music, pop culture, whatever. The indoctrination is so profound, so permeated into the bones of our culture, that it's hard, even for a cynic like me, to buy that the American dream is dead. In the first video I did titled Why No One Wants to Work, The Broken Contract, I spelled out the mechanisms at work stripping you of buying power. The problem is that these topics aren't sexy. People hear you start talking about fiat currency and their eyes glaze over. They get the same expression people often have while consuming TikTok or Instagram. I think I'm going to start calling that look scroll face. There are levels of deception at play that the average shelf stocker at Walmart or wrench turner at Firestone are not meant to understand. One of these things is the little sheafs of green paper with dead presidents on them. America has such a relationship with death in graven images. It's pretty creepy when you really put some brain cells on the topic. Portable headstones that we slide into the leather coffins in our pockets. Federal Reserve notes, or FRNs for short, represent units of debt. They are not money. Rather, they are legal tender with purchasing power. Those are what is colloquially known as dollars. But it's long been a misnomer of the English language here in the United States because it's been about 100 years since the FRN, or $1, was actually worth $1. And just in time to put the cherry on top of my frustration Sunday, the History Channel is running a docudrama on George Washington. As I am typing this out, I can already foresee the deluge of Kelsey Grammer's creepy, staring commercial endorsements for this show, and it makes me want to punt my Amazon tracking device, I mean Fire Stick, right into the sun. I doubt it very much if old George, were he alive today, would have approved of slapping a false numerical value onto a bill bearing his likeness. Men were very serious about reputation back in those days. Putting someone else's endorsement on a fraudulent contract was grounds for hole punchers at dawn. Doubly so when the contract was odious to the Constitution, which it was and continues to be. The dollar is a contract between you, the private citizen, and the federal government. Congress's duty was to print and coin money and determine its set value. That money is supposed to be stable enough to be reliably used to barter one's materials, labor, and other forms of property within the United States. Today, of course, the Federal Reserve has been given that mandate. I feel like this was about spreading the blame for any negative repercussions around, obscuring fault and responsibility behind a wall of made-up red tape and bureaucracy. This way, the federal government gets access to all the money they want, but if anything goes pear-shaped, they can give us the no-neck or palms up and point at the Fed chair or whoever, who will in turn point back at the sitting administration. A singularity of blame ensues, and only the Federal Reserve has the jurisdiction to investigate itself, because it is a private corporation. Maybe there was no poison in that attic. Perhaps it was bird pox, or maybe a cat had been dragging its prey into the attic. I wonder, was its owner's name, rather, Schrodinger? Asking for a friend, bro. Just asking for a friend. If I really wanted to, I could have investigated the animal crime scene in that attic. I could have sought out third-party investigators more knowledgeable than myself if I hit a roadblock. There's a veritable ocean of information at our fingertips these days. The only real thing stopping any of us from finding out is ourselves and the tech overlords censoring wrongthink, of course. If we just had the time, if we just had the foxtrots to give. But House of the Dragon is on, and there's the new season of The Boys, yada, yada, yada. If you had a hole in your pocket and things kept falling through it, getting lost, would you keep putting stuff in those pockets? Probably not. What if everyone around you, every major institute of learning, every media outlet, every politician, every influencer, was constantly telling you that what you were observing to be true wasn't? You might eventually start to believe the propane lighting. You might say to yourself, I never owned a second house key. I must have forgotten the 43 cents at the self-checkout. My debit card was never real. My driver's license was never real. I'm not even sure I'm wearing pants right now. I can feel the fabric against my skin. I know there are legs there, or at least leg-shaped objects. And the downward logical spiral goes. Alice in Wonderland effect at maximum force. And this is what we're being subjected to. The US dollar is that container with an ever-growing hole in it, slowly leaking your buying power while you are still in the process of earning it via work. And just like your buying power is being diminished, the employers themselves also experience this. True, it isn't as painful to someone with disposable income, but they do feel it and take it into account, both on a personal level and a business level. The Wall Street ticker shows us record profits year after year after year, but again, adjusting for dollar devaluation, you get a much more sobering look at the truth. A fiat system requires perpetual growth to sustain itself. But perpetual growth is not itself sustainable. Instead, regulators, fact-checkers, and governmental statistical groups have become adept at perpetual artifice. Don't get me wrong, video games are fun, but the numbers on those screens, the ones and zeros, have no bearing on reality. The old rules still apply. Limited resources, limited buying power. But now the game has moved screens, with one set of information available to the public, thanks Jim Cramer, and the real set of information available only to a select few. That's not us, by the way. No matter how many dollars you print into the system, the resources are what they are. And I've got an article here from Zero Hedge. Head of Chase Bank warns customer era of free checking likely over. It's never enough for the money interest. Organizations like Chase Manhattan Bank are now decrying the capping of overdraft fees and late credit card payment fees to a more reasonable level. I have zero sympathy for these institutions. They themselves laid the groundwork, making our economy the unstable mess that it is today. Hard facts: if you're not making $100K a year and up, you should not have a credit card. And most of us are not making that kind of bread. Debit card transactions are yet another self-inflicted wound by the banking sector. I remember when, if you didn't have sufficient funds, the transaction simply would not go through. Declined, insufficient funds. And that was it. No fees, no overdraft. Your transaction just didn't work. It was embarrassing when it happened, sure, but at least you didn't have to worry about getting dinged with multiple $50 fees for accidentally going over the available funds. This was the exact scenario that played out about a decade ago when I used Armed Forces Bank. They and other banks were structuring payment transactions so that the greater amounts were processed first, no matter when the actual purchases were made. Obviously, this maximized penalty-based income for the banks and royally put the screws to my wallet, which is why, to this very day, I tell every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine to never bank with AFB. Sadly, the phenomenon of overdraft has been visited on the debit checking side of banking as well. Insofar as I've had experience, they're all doing this crap now. It's a feature, not a bug. When I asked the associate setting up my account with Chase 6 years ago whether I could be excluded from the overdraft program, she looked at me like I had 5 heads. Why would someone ever want to be exempted from this amazing program? If banks or any corporation can make an oopsie and profit from it, what's to stop them from intentional oopsies in the future? Nothing. The FDIC supposedly insures my deposit by up to $250,000. That's great. Now I just have to work another 40 years and I might have enough money to buy a large bag, large enough to fit all that money into. Most Americans will never see that much money in their lives. We're more concerned about the $11.96 in our account right now and how we're going to stretch that out for food and gas and other necessities to make it to the next measly paycheck. What's the FDIC doing to protect my $11.96? Chase has some pair of brass ones making that statement. Free checking is likely over. Checking has never been free. When a customer deposits money to the bank uses a fraction of that money, allegedly, to make loans available to other customers. They're already using my damn money, and yours. That's how fractional reserve banking works, ostensibly, right? That's what they keep telling us. Thanks to the Fed setting the fractional reserve rate to 0 a year ago, now they can lend all of it. Don't journalist on me and tell me it's raining. Market adjustment, my backside. You're turning your institutions into subscription models. Just like every other business out there now. Health insurance, life insurance, car payments, video games, video streaming, dating apps, computer software. Virtually all of it. And don't forget the advertisements on everything. This is conditioning. They don't need more money, they want more power. And now they want to take the rights away from you regarding your money. Service fees incurred for dipping below the minimum balance requirements penalize poor folks, and it's completely arbitrary and hostile to 90% of Americans. They are making you rent your money. A corporate tax on your money, which is a tax on your labor by extension. Now Capital One says no overdraft or minimum balance fees. But you know what? That was true for most banks decades ago. We've gotten to the point where businesses have so little respect for their customers, they will flip the contract on a dime. What happens when all companies operate in this fashion? When there are no ethical companies with whom to patronize? The way America has transformed the dollar stamps a prerequisite on companies to predate on their customers and one another or go bust. The Wall Street ticker doesn't track growth so much as it does stability. If a company is truly growing, it's only doing so because someone else got shafted. Welcome to the zero-sum game of MMT, modern monetary theory. A high-stakes poker game where the house can and will change the rules mid-hand. It really makes me wonder what's going on with NVIDIA. Maybe it's not a stock bubble. However, I see a round shape. I see bright colors. I don't know what's filling it, but it's floating upwards in the air. Quack, quack. There was some struggle on my end while I was writing this piece. I couldn't determine which creature I was in the analogy, the rat or the snake. If I'm taking my whole life into account, I've been both at one point or another, and that's probably true for a lot of people as well. But upon closer evaluation, I think I'd probably be more analogous to the stuffy insulation material. That is the lot of the 90% of the working class in the United States today. Cheap, abrasive, dirty, haggard, but completely necessary for society to function, at least until they replace us all with robots. They may not like us. They may look down on us. Our opinions may cause rash or discomfort. But without people like us, the heat and cold would be a far greater threat. Speaking of heat and cold, did you know that the Fed has a target unemployment rate? Isn't that bonkers? A private corporation gets to make that call for the entirety of America. And if the number goes down too much, i.e. there's too many people employed, they will intentionally shake the market up to get it back to the point they want. For the Fed, the market heating up is when too many of us normal people have too much money. We can't have that. Poor people are needed to work desperation jobs. And you can't have desperation jobs if you eliminate desperation from the workforce. Walmart, Dollar General, Firestone, 7-Eleven would all have to change their entire business model. Woe is Wall Street. Won't somebody please think of the shareholders? Every facet of our country is geared towards evil and destructive behaviors. Shaft the other guy so you can get a leg up. Now the only ladder to success are the bodies of your fellow countrymen and women. You can probably guess who I think the snake is in this analogy. The rat is the business that predates on the worker. The payday lenders, the used car sales lots tacking on an extra $10,000 just because they can, and every other cartel is doing it too. The rental companies doing the same thing to their tenants, cringing in disgust when the peasants can't afford the increase a third year in a row. You, the worker, are the problem. You should have gotten a better job, or a second, third, or fourth job. Pull yourself up by your non-existent bootstraps. I would like to close out by reading part of a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to Samuel Kercheval in 1816. I am not among those who fear the people. They, and not the rich, are our dependents for continued freedom. And to preserve their independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. We must make our election between economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude. If we run into such debts as that we must be taxed in our meat and in our drink, in our necessities, in our comforts, in our labors and amusements, for our callings and our creeds, as the people of England are, our people, like them, must come to labor 16 hours in the 24, give the earnings of 15 of these to the government for their debts and daily expenses, and the 16th, being insufficient to afford us bread, we must live as they now do, on oatmeal and potatoes. Have no time to think, no means of calling the mismanagers to account, but be glad to obtain subsistence by hiring ourselves to rivet their chains on the necks of our fellow sufferers. And I'm going to break off from the quote here for a minute for this. When you put your hand on the spigot of money creation, when you take out a loan or a mortgage, that is what you are doing, hiring yourself to rivet chains on your fellow Americans. Same thing for student loans. There's a bit more here, and I think this is important. Quote, our landholders, too, like theirs, retaining indeed the title of stewardship of estates called theirs, but held really in trust for the treasury, must wander, like theirs, in foreign countries and be contented with penury, obscurity, exile, and the glory of the nation. This example reads to us the salutary lesson that private fortunes are destroyed by public as well as private extravagance. And this is the tendency of all human governments. A departure from principle in one instance becomes a precedent for a second, that second for a third, and so on, till the bulk of society is reduced to mere automatons of misery, and to have no sensibilities left but for sinning and suffering. Then begins indeed the bellum omnium in omnia, which some philosophers, observing to be so general in this world, have mistaken it for the natural instead of the abusive state of man. And the forehorse of this frightful team is public debt. Taxation follows that, and in its train, wretchedness and oppression. Does any of this sound familiar? We stopped teaching the lessons of history, stopped applying them in action to the operation of this country. And then this is where we are, right back to where we started 250 years ago. Worse in some regards. Maybe this isn't an analogy, so much as it is a vehicle for discussion this country sorely needs to have amongst itself. Walls are closing in on the working American, and soon the only options are going to be crime or death. And that's not the America I want to live in. TICD44@protonmail.com for questions or comments. Server protective.